The morning my family finally turned their backs on me began without warning in a cramped townhouse on the south side of Columbus, Ohio. It was just 6 in the morning. The sky outside my kitchen window was a dull gray, the kind that presses down and seems to linger over rooftops longer than it should. A light drizzle tapped against the glass in uneven intervals, gentle enough to be ignored but persistent enough to be noticed. I stood at the counter in my socks, gripping a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, its surface untouched since I poured it. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's dish soap and stale toast. A single bulb buzzed softly above the sink, casting a yellow glow over the cluttered counter. The refrigerator hummed in the background, steady and indifferent. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked as the house settled, reminding me how thin the walls were and how small the space felt when everything else in life seemed uncertain. The quiet felt deliberate, almost watchful. It was the kind of silence that comes before phones start ringing and engines turn over. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing against wet pavement. I followed the sound until it disappeared, then realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly and leaned my hip against the counter, trying to ground myself in the ordinary details of the morning. I felt uneasy without being able to explain it. There was no phone call waiting, no message lighting up my screen, no argument left unresolved from the night before. Still, something sat heavy in my chest, pressing inward in a way that made it hard to stand still. I glanced at the clock above the stove, its second hand ticking loudly in the quiet, and counted my breaths the way I had learned to do during stressful days at work. I told myself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just another weekday morning before school drop-offs and traffic and long hours. I reminded myself that life had been heavy lately, and that exhaustion could make everything feel sharper than it was. Even as I tried to reason with myself, I knew that this feeling was different. It was not panic or fear. It was anticipation, like standing on the edge of something you cannot yet see. I picked up my phone from the counter and checked it again, even though I had already done that twice. No missed calls, no new messages. I locked the screen and set it back down, annoyed with myself for expecting something to be there. The silence remained unchanged. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding onto a secret. I walked to the window and rested my forehead lightly against the cool glass. Raindrops slid down in thin, uneven lines, blurring the view of the neighboring townhouses. For a moment, I watched them fall and told myself that whatever this day brought, I would handle it the way I always did. One step at a time. Still, deep down, I sensed that something had already shifted, and that the life I thought I understood was about to feel unfamiliar. My name is Danielle Brooks. At the time, I was 36 years old, living in Columbus, Ohio, in a townhouse that always felt a little too narrow for the life I was trying to hold together. I was a single mother to my daughter, Lily, who was 8 years old and already more perceptive than I sometimes gave her credit for. Our mornings followed a predictable rhythm. Alarm clocks, cereal bowls, backpacks by the door. Routine was something I relied on. It gave structure to days that might otherwise feel unstable. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a neighborhood where houses were close together and privacy was limited. People noticed when you came home late or left early. My parents believed family was permanent, something you stayed loyal to regardless of conflict. Arguments happened openly and loudly, but forgiveness was expected to follow without discussion. It was not framed as a choice. It was simply how things were done. I was the middle child, wedged between two stronger personalities. My older sister Renee was decisive and outspoken, the kind of person who took control of situations before anyone else had time to react. My younger sister Carla was emotional and intense, quick to demand attention and equally quick to withdraw it. I learned early that keeping the peace often meant staying flexible and quiet. I adapted myself to whatever tone the room needed it. After high school, college felt like something meant for other people. Money was tight and I did not want to burden my parents with more expense. I worked retail jobs, then clerical work, slowly figuring out how to move forward without a clear map. Years later, I enrolled in night classes while working full-time, sitting in classrooms filled with younger students who seemed far more certain about their futures than I was. Eventually, I built a career in medical records at a local clinic. The work was detailed and methodical, which suited me. I liked knowing that accuracy mattered, that being careful had value. The pay was modest, but it kept the lights on and allowed me to provide stability for Lily. Stability mattered to me more than anything else. My life revolved around responsibility. I woke up early, packed lunches, navigated school drop-offs, and drove through traffic with the radio turned low. After work, I rushed home to cook dinner, help with homework, and prepare for the next day. But evenings were quiet. Once Lily was asleep, I often sat alone at the kitchen table, sorting mail or reviewing schedules, trying to stay one step ahead of everything. Family had always been central to how I understood myself. I believed showing up consistently was a form of love. I believed effort mattered. I believed that when things became difficult, people leaned toward each other rather than away. Those beliefs were not dramatic or idealistic to me. They were practical, built from years of watching my mother hold our family together through exhaustion and illness. Looking back, I see how deeply those beliefs shaped my expectations. At the time, they felt unshakable. I did not yet understand how easily foundations can crack when the person holding them in place is gone. The shift in my family did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as grief and fatigue, the kind that follows a loss everyone assumes will bring people closer together. After my mother passed away, the days blurred into one another. I handled practical matters because that was what I knew how to do. Phone calls to insurance companies, follow-ups with doctors, sorting through paperwork that still carried her handwriting. At first, my sisters and I spoke regularly. The conversations were short and careful, filled with logistical questions rather than emotion. We talked about arrangements, obligations, and what needed to be done next. No one asked how anyone was coping. We all seemed to agree, without saying it aloud, that feelings could wait. Once the formal responsibilities ended, the distance began to show. Messages went unanswered for hours, then days. When I called, the conversations felt rushed. Renee always seemed busy. Carla's tone shifted between distracted and irritated. I told myself they were grieving in their own ways. I told myself patience was part of being family. Weeks passed, and the silence grew heavier. I noticed I was always the one reaching out. I was the one initiating contact, suggesting coffee, checking in. When responses came, they felt restrained, as if something unspoken sat between us. I replayed every conversation in my mind, searching for words that might have caused offense. Grief has a way of sharpening insecurities. I began to wonder if I had done something wrong during my mother's illness. I questioned whether my choices had been judged quietly while I was focused on Bobu. Doubt settled in, persistent and exhausting. The first real sign that something was broken came during a conversation about family traditions. I mentioned an upcoming holiday, assuming we would spend it together as we always had. The pause on the other end of the line lasted too long. Renee cleared her throat and changed the subject. Carla did not respond at all. The moment passed, but it left a mark. I felt excluded without being directly told I was no longer included. That ambiguity made everything worse. There was nothing concrete to confront, no argument to resolve. Just absence. Just distance. At night, after Lily fell asleep, I sat alone and tried to make sense of it. I wondered if my role in the family had changed without my consent. I wondered if my value had been reassessed once my mother was no longer there to advocate for me. These thoughts were unsettling, but they felt impossible to ignore. The struggle was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle and persistent. It lived in unanswered messages and unreturned calls. It lived in conversations that ended too quickly and invitations that never came. Slowly, I began to understand that something fundamental was shifting, and that no amount of patience or effort on my part seemed to stop it. I did not yet realize how far the distance would go. At that point, I still believed the silence would eventually break. I still believed that family, no matter how strained, would find its way back to itself. As the distance settled into place, it began to affect the parts of my life that were usually predictable. Mornings became harder to move through. I woke up tired even after a full night of sleep, my mind already busy before my feet touched the floor. I moved through routines on autopilot, packing lunches, tying shoelaces, checking the clock more often than necessary. Lily noticed the change before I did. She asked why I seemed quiet. I told her I was just thinking about work. At the clinic, I struggled to focus. Tasks that once felt manageable now required extra effort. I reread patient files, double-checked entries, worried constantly about making mistakes. My supervisor asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes. It felt easier to carry the weight silently than to explain something I barely understood myself. Evenings stretched longer than they used to. After dinner, the house fell quiet too quickly. I missed the casual phone calls that once filled that space, the updates about small family matters that made me feel connected. Now, the silence felt deliberate. I caught myself checking my phone repeatedly, even when I knew there would be nothing new. Weekends were the hardest. They used to be reserved for family visits or shared meals. Without those anchors, time felt unstructured and empty. I took Lily to the park, to the library, to the grocery store, trying to create a sense of normalcy. I smiled for her sake, but inside I felt unmoored, unsure of where I belonged. The exclusion seeped into my sense of self. I began questioning decisions I had made years earlier. I wondered if being reliable rather than assertive had made me easy to overlook. I replayed moments from my mother's illness, questioning whether my efforts had been enough or if resentment had been building quietly all along. At night, when the house was dark and still, my thoughts grew louder. I lay awake listening to distant traffic and the occasional creak of the townhouse settling. I told myself that families go through difficult periods. I reminded myself that grief looks different for everyone. Still, the absence felt personal, as if something essential had been withdrawn without explanation. I tried reaching out one last time, sending a simple message asking if we could talk. The response came hours later and said little t. The words were polite but distant, carefully chosen and emotionally hollow. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, realizing that effort alone was no longer enough to bridge the gap. By then, the impact was impossible to ignore. The struggle was no longer just emotional. It was shaping my days, my energy, and my sense of stability. I was functioning, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. And I could feel myself bracing for whatever came next. The tension did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, day by day, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. Missed calls that were never returned. Family group messages that continued without my name included. Plans made and carried out without my knowledge. Each instance felt small on its own, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I learned about my cousin's engagement through a photo someone else posted online. I recognized the living room in the background immediately. It was my sister's house. The caption was cheerful, filled with congratulations and heart emojis. I stared at the screen, trying to understand how an entire gathering could happen without anyone thinking to tell me. I set the phone down and finished washing the dishes, my hands moving mechanically as my chest tightened. At work, the strain followed me. I found myself distracted during meetings, nodding while missing key details. My supervisor gently reminded me to take a personal day if I needed one. I thanked her and said I would think about it, knowing I could not afford the loss of hours. Responsibility left little room for emotional recovery. The pressure showed up in my body next. Tension headaches that started behind my eyes and refused to fade. A constant tightness in my shoulders. I woke up some mornings with my jaw clenched, my teeth aching from grinding them in my sleep. I told myself stress was normal. I told myself this would pass. It did not. One evening, I ran into my sister at a grocery store near her neighborhood. The encounter was brief but jarring. She smiled politely, the kind of smile reserved for acquaintances rather than family. We exchanged a few surface-level words about the weather and our schedules. She mentioned a family dinner happening the following weekend, then stopped herself mid-sentence. The pause said more than the words ever could. She changed the subject and excused herself, cart rolling away before I could respond. I sat in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the embarrassment. It was not anger I felt in that moment. It was confusion mixed with grief. I did not understand what rule I had broken or when the decision had been made to keep me at a distance. At home, Lily sensed the shift again. She asked why we did not visit Aunt Rachel anymore. I told her people get busy. She accepted the answer, but her questions lingered in the air long after she went to bed. I lay awake wondering how long I could protect her from the truth when I barely understood it myself. I finally asked for clarity. I called my mother one evening after Lily fell asleep. The conversation was strained from the start. Her responses were careful, guarded. She spoke about needing space, about not wanting conflict. When I asked what I had done, she said she did not want to get into it. The call ended without resolution, leaving me more unsettled than before. That was when I realized the tension was no longer passive. It had become intentional. Silence was being used as a boundary I had not agreed to but was expected to respect. The uncertainty weighed on me more heavily than any argument ever could. I went to bed that night feeling suspended between connection and isolation. The ground beneath my sense of belonging felt unstable. I did not know what the next step would be, but I could feel myself approaching an emotional edge, one shaped by unanswered questions and the slow realization that some losses happen quietly without confrontation or closure. The emotional low point did not arrive with a dramatic moment. It settled in quietly, like exhaustion that had nowhere to go. It showed up in the small hours of the night, when the house was still and my thoughts had nothing left to distract them. One night, I woke up just after 2 in the morning, the digital clock glowing faintly on the dresser. My throat felt tight, as if I had been holding my breath for hours. I lay there listening to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional car passing on the wet street outside. The world kept moving, indifferent to the weight pressing down on my chest. I stopped trying to sleep and went to the living room. I sat on the couch with my knees pulled close, staring at the dark television screen. The reflection staring back at me looked older than I felt. Tired eyes, slumped shoulders. A woman trying to understand when she had become optional to the people who raised her. The questions replayed themselves without mercy. What did I say wrong? What did I miss? How did distance replace familiarity without anyone explaining why? I searched my memory for arguments, harsh words, moments of selfishness. I found nothing that matched the punishment I was living through. The hardest part was the silence. No confrontation meant no chance to respond. No explanation meant no way to repair what was broken. I was left standing in the space where connection used to live, expected to accept absence as the final answer. The weight began to show in my daily life. I forgot to return emails. I stared too long at nothing. I lost my appetite and forced myself to eat because Lily needed dinner, not because I felt hungry. Some evenings, I sat at the kitchen table after she went to bed, untouched plates in front of me, the light above humming softly as tears slipped down without sound. One afternoon, Lily asked why Grandma had not come to her school play. I had no answer that would not confuse or hurt her. I told her Grandma was busy. The lie felt thin and fragile in my mouth. After Lily went to her room, I stood at the sink and cried harder than I had in years, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. That was the moment I realized how deeply this loss had reached. It was no longer just about me. It was shaping my child's understanding of family, of presence, of who shows up when it matters. I felt ashamed for wanting answers, ashamed for feeling hurt, ashamed for hoping they would come back without being asked. The shame layered itself over grief until I felt numb, unsure which emotion belonged to me anymore. One evening, after Lily fell asleep on the couch beside me, I stayed there long after the house had gone quiet. Her head rested against my arm, her breathing steady and warm. I watched her and felt both grounded and broken at the same time. I promised myself she would never feel disposable the way I did in that moment. That night, I understood that something inside me had reached its limit. I could not continue waiting for permission to matter. The silence had taken enough. I did not know yet what change would look like, but I knew I could not stay where I was emotionally and survive intact. This was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that. It was the slow realization that clinging to people who had already let go was costing me pieces of myself. I could not afford to lose. The turning point arrived unexpectedly during a parent-teacher meeting at Lily's elementary school. The room smelled faintly of crayons, hand sanitizer, and polished wood. Small backpacks hung from hooks along the walls, and tiny chairs were scattered around tables covered in colored construction paper. I had arrived early, clutching a folder with Lily's latest assignments. Still tired from the day's work, her teacher, Mrs. Hammond, a woman in her mid-40s with a gentle voice and a quiet confidence, began talking about Lily's performance. At first, I tuned out, distracted by the sound of tiny footsteps in the hall and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But then Mrs. Hammond's words reached me. Lily had been helping classmates who were struggling, volunteering to read aloud during group activities, and comforting friends who had hurt feelings. She had been praised not for her grades alone, but for her empathy, her attentiveness, and her kindness toward others. Listening, I felt a jolt deep in my chest. My daughter, the little girl I had been trying to protect from disappointment, was watching me endure my own challenges and choosing to respond with compassion rather than bitterness. In that moment, the tension I had carried for months, the frustration, the grief, the silent resentment shifted into something quieter, more purposeful. I realized that my energy wasted on trying to win acknowledgement from family members who had already turned away could be redirected toward the life I was building with Lily. I sat straighter in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of pride and relief. The harsh, heavy weight of waiting for reconciliation began to lift. I understood that I did not need external validation to feel whole or to be a capable parent. My daughter's growth, her ability to navigate the world with empathy, was proof that the values I had lived by mattered more than the approval of those who could not offer it. Walking back to the car afterwards, I noticed the way the late afternoon sun reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. It seemed brighter than usual, warmer. The world outside felt alive in ways I had been too consumed by worry to notice. For the first time in weeks, I imagined a path forward where I was not waiting, not hoping for someone else to return my effort. I could step into life intentionally, shaping the environment I wanted for myself and my daughter. That evening at home, I made a conscious decision to set boundaries I had never enforced before. I stopped calling my sisters first. I limited the conversations that led to arguments or guilt. When messages arrived, I read them, responded politely, and let go of the need to chase engagement. My focus shifted to small, practical actions, preparing dinner together, reading bedtime stories, helping Lily with her homework. These moments, simple and ordinary, became the foundation of something steadier, a life I could control rather than plead for. The turning point was not a sudden miracle. It was subtle, slow, and earned. It arrived through quiet observation, reflection, and a recognition of what truly mattered. It was in the way Lily approached the world, the evidence that compassion and resilience were contagious, and the realization that I could direct my attention where it would actually grow something meaningful. From that day on, I stopped trying to repair the unfixable and started nurturing what I could. The change was not dramatic or immediate, but it was enduring. It created space for clarity, for strength, and for the patient work of reclaiming my own life. The weeks that followed were neither easy nor neat. Change had begun, but life did not suddenly shift into perfection. Mornings still came early, traffic still snarled through Columbus streets, and the responsibilities of work and parenting remained constant. What had changed was the way I carried it all. I moved with intention, letting go of unnecessary burdens and protecting the energy that had long been wasted on seeking approval from family who had chosen distance. I focused on Lily's routines with care. Breakfasts became moments of connection rather than mechanical preparation. We would linger over cereal, talking about school projects, favorite books, and the small victories she experienced each day. I listened more than I spoke, paying attention to her laughter, her curiosity, the way she observed the world with both caution and wonder. These ordinary moments reminded me that life could be meaningful even when family ties were strained. At work, I allowed myself to prioritize mental space. I completed tasks thoroughly but stopped overextending to anticipate others' expectations. My supervisor noticed a subtle change in my demeanor. I was calmer, more focused. My interactions with colleagues felt lighter because I was no longer carrying invisible weight from home. Financial independence became a quiet source of pride. I mapped out a budget, explored small investments, and considered ways to build a safety net for Lily and myself. Each decision, though practical and sometimes mundane, reinforced a sense of control that had been absent during the months of family tension. Social life remained minimal, but meaningful. I reconnected with friends who had been supportive in the past and discovered new communities through school events and local parenting groups. These connections were not meant to replace family, but they offered companionship, validation, and an occasional reminder that care can be found beyond the people who have hurt us. The endurance was not linear. Some nights, old feelings returned unexpectedly. A text from my sister would trigger a wave of longing or resentment. A holiday or family gathering nearby would remind me of absence. During those times, I reminded myself that survival was not about perfection. It was about persistence. It was about recognizing progress even when setbacks appeared. I also developed routines to process emotions rather than ignore them. Journaling became a nightly habit. I wrote about frustration, grief, and small victories. I allowed myself to name the hurt without judgment. Exercise, long walks through wet streets or sunlit parks became an outlet for tension and a space to think clearly. Slowly, the numbness and fatigue from the emotional low point began to lift. Lily noticed the change too. She began to smile more openly, to express gratitude for small daily routines. One evening, as we baked cookies together, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, I like our life." It was not the approval of absent family members that mattered. It was this tangible, present connection, the result of patience, reflection, and consistent effort. Endurance also meant accepting limitations. I could not repair the relationships that had fractured, and I stopped trying to force reconciliation. Instead, I focused on maintaining civility when contact occurred, and on keeping my boundaries firm. This required honesty with myself and sometimes uncomfortable conversations with those still in my life. Yet every small boundary I honored reinforced my sense of self. By the end of that season, I realized survival was not about escaping pain. It was about moving forward with awareness, embracing responsibility for my own well-being, and nurturing the life I wanted for my daughter. Each step, no matter how small, mattered. The storms of family rejection did not vanish, but they lost the power to define the trajectory of my life. In endurance, I discovered resilience, not the grand, dramatic kind, but the quiet, persistent strength that allows a woman to rise each day, to face responsibility with intention, and to hold her values close, even when others have chosen distance. Years have passed since the moment my family turned their backs. Today, I live in a small but comfortable apartment in downtown Columbus, a place filled with sunlight and the sound of city life just outside my window. Lily is thriving in school, her curiosity and kindness continuing to grow in ways that remind me daily why endurance matters. Looking back, I see the turning point with clarity. I understand now that the fractures in my family were not a reflection of my worth. They were the result of unhealed wounds, miscommunication, and choices made long before I could influence them. The pain was real, but it no longer defines me. I have learned to value the quiet victories, the bedtime stories that elicit laughter. The successful presentation at work, the friend who calls just to check in. Each moment is a testament to resilience. A reminder that life's meaning often resides in the everyday choices to continue, even when recognition is absent. I still think of my sisters occasionally. I wonder how their lives unfold and whether they ever reflect on the distance that grew between us. The longing is no longer accompanied by expectation or frustration. It exists simply as acknowledgement of a shared past I cannot change. In my own life, I have created rituals and spaces that bring stability. Morning coffee with calm music. Weekly walks in the neighborhood park with Lily. Evenings dedicated to reflection and journaling. These routines allow me to process the residual emotions without becoming consumed by them. I also recognize the lessons of endurance and self-preservation. I now understand that prioritizing one's emotional well-being is not selfish, it is necessary. By nurturing myself and Lily, I am cultivating a life defined by love, attention, and intentional presence rather than absence or rejection. This season of my life didn't end with an apology or a reunion. There was no dramatic phone call, no moment where everyone suddenly understood what they had done. Instead, it ended the way so many real chapters do, slowly, quietly, almost without ceremony. Life went on. Some days felt manageable. Other days felt heavier than I expected. Joy and loss learned how to share the same space. I celebrated milestones while enduring grief. I learned that growth doesn't erase pain, and pain doesn't cancel growth. They exist together, who we are. What surprised me most was where the strength actually came from. It didn't come in one brave decision or bold declaration. It showed in small ways. By choosing not to chase explanations that were never coming, by protecting my peace, by showing up for my daughter every day with steadfastness and honesty, in building a life that felt safe, even when parts of my past were gone. Over time, I stopped waiting for closure from those who couldn't offer it. Instead, I offered it to myself. It was the quiet turn I never expected. I didn't need reconciliation to move forward. I needed clarity. And once I had that, there was no place for bitterness to linger. Now, when I look back, I don't feel angry. I feel at peace. I'm proud of the woman who kept going when it would have been easier to give up. I'm grateful for the life my daughter and I are still writing together. One shaped by compassion, boundaries, and resilience. If this chapter has taught me anything, it's that family history doesn't determine the future. We do, one choice at a time. So this isn't a bitter goodbye. This is a farewell to the version of me that was waiting to be chosen. It is a silent goodbye to hopes that no longer serve me. And it is a gentle hello to a life that I shape with my own hands. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, if you have had to move forward without the people you thought would always stand by you, you are not alone. I would love to hear your story in the comments. Your voice matters here. Thank you for listening. This was My Truth.